It all began on a late night when Karoline Leavitt, 27, the youngest White House press secretary in American history, sat in her small apartment near Washington, D.C. The dim light cast shadows on her tired face as she fed her son while scrolling through a pile of work emails. The press had torn her apart again today over a statement about Trump's military policy, but she was used to it. Pressure was her daily companion. Suddenly, a strange email caught her eye. No subject, just a sender's name, Sophie March. Leavitt frowned, opening it. The message was short but sharp as a blade. Miss Leavitt, I'm a Navy captain, 28 years old. I have something to say, not for me, but for those who serve in silence. Please meet me. No greeting. No pleading. Just a bold request. Leavitt set the bottle down, her heart beating faster. Who would dare write like this? The next morning, Karoline Leavitt walked into her office with dark circles under her eyes but a sharp mind. Last night, she'd barely slept, her thoughts consumed by Sophie Marshall's brief letter. Serve in silence. The phrase echoed in her head, a puzzle with no answer. Yet. She set her coffee cup on the desk and called her chief aide, Ryan, into the room. Found anything on Sophie Marshall? She asked, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Ryan, a 30-year-old with messy hair and thick glasses, placed a thin file on the desk. This is what I got from the Navy through a quick channel, Miss Leavitt, he said, pushing his glasses up. Sophie Marshall, 28, Navy captain. Graduated top of her class from the Naval Academy at 21. Commissioned as an officer right after. She took command of a patrol boat team at 26, one of the youngest in modern U.S. Navy history. Leavitt raised an eyebrow, impressed but not surprised. Youth and talent weren't foreign to her. She was breaking records at the White House herself. What about her record? Leavitt asked, flipping through the file's first page. Ryan hesitated before answering. Very impressive. She led a few anti-piracy ops off Somalia, commended for leadership under pressure. But, he paused, glancing at Leavitt as if weighing whether to go on. But what? She pressed, her tone firming. Ryan sighed. There's a blemish. 3 years ago, on a mission in the South China Sea, she ordered an attack on a suspected smuggler ship. It was a mistake. A civilian vessel sank. 6 people died, including Lieutenant Ethan Blake, her best friend. The official report blamed bad intel, but Sophie was investigated. She was cleared, but it left a mark. Leavitt stopped flipping pages, her hand freezing on the bolded line. Lieutenant Ethan Blake. Killed in action. She pictured Sophie, a young woman just a year older than her, standing on a ship's deck, giving orders under a gray sky, then watching flames erupt from her own decision. A fleeting thought crossed Leavitt's mind. Her standing at a press podium, misspeaking a single line, and the world turning on her. No deaths, but haunting enough. Is that why she wrote? Leavitt wondered silently, not voicing it. Meanwhile, Sophie Marshall's memory drifted back to that fateful day. She stood on the bridge, the salty sea wind stinging her face. Ethan, with his confident smile and bright eyes, stood beside her. Orders away, Captain, he said, his tone teasing. Sophie nodded, commanding the strike based on intel that the ship held weapons. But when the smoke cleared, civilian screams rose from the wreckage. Ethan rushed to save them, but a second explosion took him forever. Sophie stood there, hands trembling on the railing, watching flames reflect in her eyes. Since then, she carried Ethan like a ghost, exactly what he'd once told her not to do. Back at the White House, Leavitt leaned back in her chair, fingers tapping the desk. She's not after fame, she said to Ryan. If she wanted that, she'd have gone on TV by now. This is personal. Ryan nodded. But if the press gets wind of it, it'll be big. A young captain. A deadly call. Now meeting you? They'll shred us. Leavitt gave a faint smile. They shred me every day already. What's one more time? She stood, gazing out the window. Outside, Washington's sky was gray, signaling a long day ahead. Leavitt thought of Sophie, a woman like her, doubted for her youth, weighed down by responsibility. The letter wasn't a plea. It was a voice stifled too long. This could be a chance, Leavitt thought. Not just to understand Sophie, but to prove she wasn't just Trump's mouthpiece. She could make a difference. But the risk, if this blew up, her career could crumble. Finally, she turned to Ryan. Set up the meeting this afternoon. Oval Office. No leaks. I want to hear it from her. Ryan nodded and left. Leavitt picked up the letter again, rereading the line, for those who serve in silence. She didn't know what Sophie wanted, but a jolt ran through her. Her instinct told her this meeting would change everything. At the same time, at Joint Base Andrews, a military plane touched down. Sophie Marshall stepped out, uniform crisp, eyes resolute but hands clenched slightly. She didn't know how Leavitt would react. But she was ready. Even if it was just one shot, she had to speak. Not for herself, but for Ethan, and for the soldiers still suffering in the shadows. That afternoon, the Oval Office was eerily quiet. No Trump. No advisors. Just Karoline Leavitt standing near the window, holding a cold coffee mug. She wore a dark blue suit, hair tied back, but the bags under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. When the door opened, Sophie Marshall walked in, her navy uniform pristine, polished shoes clicking evenly on the hardwood. Leavitt turned, offering a slight smile to break the ice. "Captain Marshall, I bet you're better at shooting than I am at selfies," she said, her tone laced with Gen Z humor. Sophie's lips twitched, a brief smile easing the tension. "I'm not great at either, Miss Leavitt," she replied, voice low but steady. Leavitt gestured to the leather chair across from Trump's desk. "Call me Karoline. No cameras, no press, just us." Sophie nodded, sitting down, back still straight as if military posture was ingrained in her. Leavitt sat opposite, setting her mug down, her gaze sharp but not overbearing. "Your letter kept me up," she began. "You mentioned those who serve in silence. Who are they? And why me, not President Trump or some general?" Sophie took a deep breath, hands tightening on her lap. She'd prepared for this, but it still wasn't easy. "Because you're the voice, Miss Karoline Leavitt. I've seen you on TV, on X, speaking for the White House. If I wrote to the president, it'd get buried in paperwork. But you can make people listen." Leavitt raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the bluntness. "And what do you want me to make them hear?" she asked, voice lowering. Sophie met her eyes, unflinching. "The truth," she said. "That leadership isn't always glory. That every order, every call, has a cost outsiders don't see. I wrote because I'm tired of people only seeing medals and forgetting who paid for them." Her tone was even, but Leavitt sensed a torrent of emotion held back. "Like Ethan Blake?" Leavitt asked, gentle but direct. Sophie froze, her eyes flickering as if the name pierced an invisible shield. "Ryan told me about the South China Sea mission," Leavitt went on. "6 dead, including him. The report said it wasn't your fault, but I'm guessing you don't believe that." Sophie lowered her head, hands clenching tighter. "No one does," she whispered. "Not when he died on my order." The room fell silent, save for the steady tick of the wall clock. Leavitt leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "Tell me," she said, not a command but an invitation. Sophie looked up, her eyes no longer steady but filled with pain. 3 years ago," she started, voice trembling slightly, "we were tasked with stopping a suspected smuggler ship in the South China Sea. Intel said it was a legit target. I was in command. I gave the order to fire. Ethan, Lieutenant Blake, stood beside me, smiling, saying, 'Orders away, Captain.' He always trusted me." She paused, taking a long breath to steady herself. "But when the shells hit, it didn't explode like a weapons ship. It broke apart, and I heard screams. Civilians. I sent Ethan down to save them. But a second blast happened. He didn't make it back." Sophie stopped, her gaze distant, as if seeing the fire on that night sea again. "I stood there on the bridge, watching the ship burn. I heard my crew report over the radio. Wrong target. 6 dead. Blake missing. They found his body after 2 hours." Leavitt sat still, a lump in her throat. She'd never stood on a battlefield, never given an order that killed, but she knew failure. Every time the press tore into her, every time she stumbled over a word at a briefing, she wondered if she'd hurt someone. "And you still carry him?" she asked, voice softening. "Every day," Sophie replied, no hesitation. "Before that mission, Ethan told me, 'If we fail, don't turn me into a ghost.' But I did. I hear his voice every night, see his face in my dreams. I survived, but part of me died with him." She gave a faint, bitter smile. "Leadership isn't about getting it right. It's about carrying the wrongs forever." Leavitt leaned back, rubbing her chin. She thought of herself, nights spent awake, revising speeches, fearing one misstep could tank Trump's credibility or worse, harm someone out there. "I've never lost anyone because of my words," she admitted. "But I get that pressure. Every time I'm at that podium, I'm scared I'm not good enough. Scared I'll mess it all up. How do you keep going after that?" Sophie looked at her, her gaze softening for the first time. "Because if I quit, we'll speak for people like Ethan. Other soldiers, they carry scars too, but no one sees. They go home, smile for their families, but inside they're broken. I'm here for them. Leavitt nodded slowly, feeling an invisible thread tie her to Sophie. Both young. Both doubted. Both bearing burdens beyond their years. What do you want me to do with this story? Leavitt asked, voice serious. Sophie didn't answer right away. She glanced around the Oval Office, the presidential portraits on the walls, the scent of polished wood, the weight of history. I don't want fame, she said. I want the country to know the truth. That every soldier pays a price, whether they live or die. You can do that. You've got the podium, TikTok. You can make them hear. Leavitt frowned, weighing it. If she put Sophie out there, the press would pounce like vultures. They'd call it a stunt, dig up Sophie's past, question her motives. But then she looked into Sophie's eyes, resolute yet shattered, and knew she couldn't say no. I used to think I was just a mouthpiece too, Leavitt said, voice lowering. But if you're right, if soldiers are suffering in silence, I can't stand still. Are you ready to tell the nation? Sophie blinked, surprised. You're serious? She asked. Leavitt smiled, her first real smile of the day, lighting up. I don't joke about stuff this big. Tomorrow. Press room. You'll stand there. I'll set it up. But you've got to be ready. They won't go easy. Sophie nodded, her hand steady now. I've never been scared of the press. I'm just scared no one will listen. Leavitt stood, extending her hand. They will. I promise. Sophie shook it, her grip firm and sure. As Sophie left, Leavitt stood alone, staring out the window. She knew she'd just stepped into a high-stakes game. But this time, not for Trump. For herself. And for people like Sophie. The next morning, the White House press room was packed. Cameras were set up, flashes popped, and the buzz of reporters filled the air like a beehive. Karoline Leavitt stood in a corner, phone in hand, checking her last X tweet. Today, a real voice speaks. #silent service. It already had thousands of likes. But she knew the cost. The press wouldn't forgive if they smelled a stunt. She glanced at Sophie Marshall standing near the podium, navy uniform pristine, hands clenched slightly. Leavitt stepped over, resting a hand on Sophie's shoulder. Ready? She asked, voice warm but low. Sophie nodded, eyes steady. I've been ready for 3 years, she said. The questions kept coming, hard. What do you want the administration to do, Captain? Are you against Trump? Sophie answered each one, unflinching. I want better mental health support for soldiers. I'm not against anyone. I want them to live. Leavitt watched, realizing Sophie. She hadn't just survived the South China Sea mission. She'd learned to fight with words. But she also saw a flicker of fatigue in Sophie's eyes, the cost of bearing her pain to the nation. Finally, Leavitt raised a hand, ending the briefing. That's enough, she said, voice firm. I said what I needed to. Now it's on you. Listen or don't. She led Sophie off the podium, camera flashes still popping. In the hallway, Leavitt turned to Sophie. You okay? She asked, voice softening. Sophie nodded, but her hands trembled slightly. I'm fine, she said. But they won't stop, will they? Leavitt gave a faint smile. Nope. Welcome to my world. They stepped out of the press's sight, but Leavitt knew this was just the start. Her phone buzzed, a text from Trump. Good job, but brace yourself. The press will eat you alive. She smirked, texting back. They've tried. I'm still standing. She glanced at Sophie, now by a window, eyes distant. Leavitt felt the weight of this moment, not just for Sophie, but for herself. She'd opened a door, and now the whole country was peering through. Less than an hour after the briefing, social media exploded. The hashtag silent service shot to the top of X's trending list with over 300,000 mentions. Clips of Sophie Marshall's speech spread everywhere, from Gen Z TikTok accounts pairing her words with emotional music to political YouTubers dissecting every line. Karoline Leavitt sat in her office, her phone buzzing nonstop on the desk. She scrolled to a new tweet from a follower. Captain Marshall spoke real, but is Leavitt using her to shine up Trump? She sighed, tossing the phone aside. She'd expected this reaction, but the speed and venom still threw her. On TV, news channels went wild. CNN ran a headline. Navy captain exposes military's dark side in shocking briefing. MSNBC brought on a military analyst who called Sophie's speech brave but naive. Fox News took a different tack. A commentator roared. This is Leavitt's stunt, turning personal tragedy into cheap politics. Leavitt muted the TV, rubbing her temples. She knew the press would split, but the attacks on both her and Sophie still stung. She stepped into the hallway, where Sophie stood by a window, looking down at Washington's now crowded streets. "How do you feel?" Leavitt asked, voice gentle. Sophie turned, eyes still tinged with sadness but steady. "I don't care what they say about me," she replied. "But they're twisting what I want. They're making it a political game instead of hearing the soldiers." Leavitt nodded, a pang of guilt flashing through her. She'd put Sophie on that podium, and now they were both caught in the whirlwind she knew too well. Her phone buzzed again, this time Trump. She picked up, his voice booming on the other end. "Nice work, Karoline, but you just kicked a hornet's nest. The press will eat you alive." "Sure about this?" Leavitt smirked. "They've tried, boss. I'm still here. But Sophie doesn't deserve this." Trump paused, then said, "She wanted to talk. You gave her the shot. Handle it. Now, you're the press secretary." The call ended, leaving Leavitt with the question, had she done the right thing? She turned to Sophie. "Trump says I need to handle it. But I need to know, what do you want me to do next?" Sophie met her gaze, eyes sharp. "Don't let them forget the soldiers. Don't let them turn this into about you or Trump." Leavitt nodded, an idea sparking. She opened X, posting a short tweet. "Sophie Marshall didn't speak for me or the White House. She spoke for the soldiers. Listen to them. #silent service." She hit send, knowing it wouldn't kill the controversy, but at least it kept Sophie's message alive. Leavitt stepped to the podium first, the mic humming as she adjusted it. The crowd hushed, all eyes on her. "I know you all want to ask about tariffs or last week's scandal," she began, her tone playful but cutting. "But today is not about me or the White House. This is about truth. Not PR. Not politics. But what Americans need to hear." She stepped back, making room for Sophie. Whispers erupted. "A captain? Who's this? What's going on?" But Leavitt kept her face calm, though her heart pounded. Sophie stepped forward, her polished shoes clicking on the floor. She faced the crowd, curious, skeptical, even hostile faces, but didn't flinch. She took a deep breath, adjusted the mic, and began. "America loves heroes." Her voice rang out, steady and strong. "We cheer for the winners, pin medals on their chests, and call it glory. But we rarely talk about those who don't come back, or those who do, but leave pieces of their soul on the battlefield. I'm here to talk about them." The room went silent, only the faint whir of cameras breaking it. Sophie continued, her gaze distant, as if reliving the past. 3 years ago, I ordered a strike on a ship in the South China Sea. Intel said it was a military target. I trusted them. And I was wrong." She swallowed. 6 people died, including Lieutenant Ethan Blake, my best friend. He rushed to save them. But I couldn't save him. I stood on the bridge, watching the flames, hearing screams over the radio, and knew I'd killed innocents. I survived. But I carry them every day. Leavitt stood aside, a lump in her throat. She'd heard this story last night. But now, in front of dozens of cameras, it still chilled her. Sophie didn't stop. "I'm not here to apologize or justify," she said, voice hardening. "I'm here for the other soldiers. The ones who come home with fake smiles. Who stay up all night with explosions in their heads. Who take their own lives because no one sees their pain. A year ago, I met a female soldier, 24, who cut herself in the barracks because she couldn't bear the memories. No one knows her name. No one gave her a medal. She's one of those who serve in silence." The whispers started up again, but Sophie raised a hand, signaling silence. "Leadership isn't standing on a podium waving," she said, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "It's taking responsibility, even when you're wrong. It's standing up when everyone else stays quiet. I don't want the country to pity me or Ethan. I want them to see the soldier, who aren't seen, and do something for them." She paused, took a breath, then finished. "I've said my piece. The questions are yours." The press room erupted. Reporters shot up their hands, shouts crashing like waves. "Captain Marshall, are you blaming the military?" a CNN reporter yelled. Sophie looked straight at him. "No," she replied, voice calm. "I blame the silence. The military didn't fail. We fail when we don't listen to them." Another reporter from Fox News cut in. "What proof do you have of these soldiers, or is this just personal feelings?" Sophie's lips twitched, a cold smile. "I live with them. I see them every day. If you want stats, ask the Pentagon. I'm just here to tell the truth." Leavitt stood nearby, gripping her phone tightly. She knew the questions would be tough, she'd warned Sophie. But she hadn't expected Sophie to be this steely. A Washington Post reporter stood, voice sharp as a knife. Miss Leavitt, is this a White House stunt? Using a young captain to polish your image. Leavitt stepped forward, standing beside Sophie, eyes locked on the questioner. If I wanted polish, I'd have picked an easier story, she said, a hint of sarcasm in her tone. Captain Marshall came here to speak. I just gave her the mic. Tear into me if you want, but don't twist what she just said. Public reactions split hard on X. A group of younger vets backed Sophie. One wrote, I came back from Afghanistan with PTSD. No one asked if I was okay. Thank you, Captain. A TikTok account posted a video of themselves, an ex-soldier, sharing their quiet pain, tagged #SilentService. But the other side didn't let up. A freelance journalist tweeted, Sophie Marshall's just a pawn. A sob story for voter tears. Some conservatives called her a military traitor, while progressives said she was too emotional, not practical. That night, a retired General James Carver appeared on Fox News, voice deep as thunder. Leadership is action, not words, he growled. Marshall might feel guilty, but dragging personal stuff to the White House shames the military. Leavitt should know better. Leavitt watched the interview on her laptop, gripping her coffee mug tight. She wanted to scream back, but she knew that would just fan the flames. Instead, she texted Sophie. Leavitt, seen General Carver? He says we're shaming the military. Sophie, he doesn't get it. I'm not shaming anyone. I want them seen. Leavitt smiled, her respect for Sophie growing. But she also knew the pressure was mounting. The next morning, reporters ambushed her outside the White House. Miss Leavitt, is this Trump's plan? One shouted. Was Sophie Marshall forced? Leavitt stopped, staring into the cameras. No one forced anyone, she said, voice firm. She spoke because she wanted to. Do you want truth or just headlines? She walked off, leaving the noisy crowd behind. Meanwhile, Sophie got an email, the first since the briefing. It came from a Vietnam vet, 75-year-old Henry Walsh. Henry Walsh. Captain Marshall, I was at Khe Sanh in '68. I saw my friends die and carried it for 50 years. You spoke for me yesterday. Thank you. Sophie read it over and over, her eyes blurring. She texted Leavitt. Sophie, someone listened. Leavitt, then it's worth it. But not everyone agreed. A group of senior ex-officers sent an open letter to the press, calling Sophie's speech unprofessional and demanding Leavitt apologize for misusing the White House podium. Leavitt read it on her drive home, hands tight on the wheel. She knew she couldn't back down, not for her reputation, but for Sophie, for Henry Walsh, and for soldiers she'd never met. That night, she called Sophie. Leavitt, they want me to apologize, she said, voice weary. What do you think? Sophie was quiet for a moment, then said, Don't. If you apologize, they win. And the soldiers stay silent again. Leavitt nodded, though Sophie couldn't see. Then we keep going, she said. But the press won't stop. Can you handle it? Sophie gave a faint laugh over the phone. I've handled gunfire. I can handle them. Leavitt hung up, staring out her window. Outside, Washington glowed with lights, but she felt the storm still brewing. She opened X again. Hundreds of new messages, from thanks to curses. One tweet stood out. Leavitt and Marshall shook America. But for what? She smirked, asking herself the same thing. But then she remembered Henry Walsh's email. And she knew at least one person had heard. A week after the briefing, Karoline Leavitt still felt the heat. Her phone kept buzzing with X notifications, press emails, and texts from the White House comms team. But amid the chaos, one thing was clear. Sophie Marshall's speech wasn't just a moment. It was becoming a movement. The #SilentService had passed 1 million mentions. Not just from veterans, but from their families, friends, even people who'd never held a gun. Leavitt sat in her office, scrolling through a new TikTok video. A young soldier, face blurred, talked about nearly ending his life over PTSD, ending with, Thanks, Captain Marshall, for speaking for me. Leavitt texted Sophie right away. Leavitt, seen this video? They're speaking up. Sophie, I saw it. But I don't want them just talking. I want them helped. Leavitt nodded at the screen, knowing Sophie was right. Words had sparked it, but now action was needed. She called Ryan, her aide, into the room. Get me a list of veteran support groups in D.C. I want to meet them. And bring Sophie. Ryan nodded, leaving with a mix of nerves and excitement. 2 days later, Leavitt and Sophie sat in a small meeting room in central Washington, facing reps from 3 veteran organizations. No cameras, no press, just men and women who'd served, their faces weathered but eyes lighting up as Sophie walked in. A woman around 40, ponytail tight, introduced herself. I heard you on TV, Karen Torres started, voice rough. My son killed himself last year from PTSD. No one helped him. You're right. They're silent until they die. Sophie bowed her head, hands clenching under the table. I'm sorry about your son, she said, voice catching. I'm here for people like him. Karen nodded, eyes red. Another man, Tom Ellis, an Iraq vet, jumped in. We've got support groups, but not enough money, not enough people. The government talks big, does little. Leavitt leaned forward. So, what's needed to change? That night, she asked Tom, shrugged, and jotted notes on her phone. Then, she turned to Sophie. What do you think? Sophie looked around the room, her resolve back in her eyes. I want them to have a place to go. Not just to talk, but to heal. I don't know politics, but you do. Leavitt gave a faint smile. I do. Leave it to me. She stood, shaking each person's hand. We'll be back. This isn't an empty promise. On the way back to the White House, Leavitt called Trump. Boss, I need to talk about Sophie and the soldiers, she said, her voice urgent. Trump sighed on the other end. You're turning this into a big campaign, Karoline. You sure about it? She shot back. Sure. They're not just numbers, they're people. If we don't do something, who will? Trump went quiet, then said, Fine. Meet the Pentagon, get funding, but do it fast. I don't want the press saying we're slow. Leavitt smirked. Thanks, boss. The following week, Leavitt held a closed-door meeting with Deputy Secretary of Defense David Hargrove. She brought Sophie and data from veteran groups. Hargrove, a burly man with silver hair, frowned as he heard the request. How much do you want and for what? He asked. Leavitt slid a stack of documents across the table. $50 million for the first year. Open mental health support centers in 10 major states, hire specialists, and train officers to spot PTSD. Here's the data. 20 veterans kill themselves every day. We can't let that go on. Sophie cut in. I've seen them die in combat. I don't want to see them die at home. Hargrove nodded slowly, but made no promises. I'll take it up the chain, but don't expect it fast. Leavitt gave a faint smile. I don't expect fast. I expect results. The meeting ended, and as they left the room, Sophie turned to Leavitt. Do you think they'll do it? Leavitt shrugged. If they don't, I'll go on X and let the country force them. The answer came quicker than she thought. 3 days later, Hargrove called back. Budget's approved. $40 million, starting next month. Trump pushed it through. Leavitt clenched her fist under the table, texting Sophie. We got it. Sophie replied. Thank you. But Leavitt knew this wasn't her win alone. It was Sophie's, Karen's, Tom's, and thousands of other soldiers. The news spread, and the hashtag Silent Service movement grew stronger. Local veteran groups started holding meetups, sharing stories. Some active duty soldiers broke their silence, speaking about the pressures they faced. Sophie got more emails, a lieutenant in Texas, a sergeant in California, thanking her for giving them courage. She read each one, a sense of relief slowly replacing the pain of Ethan Blake. Leavitt watched it all from the White House, seeing the hashtag turn from words into action. She posted a tweet. Hashtag Silent Service isn't silent anymore. $40 million for mental health centers. This is just the start. The post got tens of thousands of likes, but she knew the press wouldn't let it rest. A Politico article popped up soon after. Leavitt and Marshall score big. But who pays for this PR stunt? She shook her head, texting Sophie. They still think it's a game. Sophie replied. Let them. We know the truth. That night, Leavitt went home. Hugging her sleeping son, she thought of Sophie, of the soldiers who now had hope. The movement had grown beyond her control, and she was proud of that. 3 weeks after the budget passed, Sophie Marshall stood among the white headstones at Arlington National Cemetery. The evening breeze carried a chill, but she didn't notice. Before her was the stone with Lieutenant Ethan Blake's name, a simple line marking the day he left in the South China Sea. Sophie knelt, placing her hand on the stone, feeling its cold surface under her fingers. She wore her Navy uniform, but today there were no duties, no orders. Just her and Ethan. I told them for you, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I told the whole country, and they heard. Not for me, but for you. For people like you. She paused, taking a deep breath to hold back tears. You told me not to make you a ghost. But I did. For 3 years. Now it's different. You're why they have hope. The wind rustled the grass, as if carrying her words away. Sophie stood, adjusted her cap, and saluted. Mission accomplished, Lieutenant. For the first time in 3 years, she felt relief. Not an end to pain, but a pain that now had meaning. At the same time, in the White House, Karoline Leavitt stood before an unusual crowd in the East Room. It wasn't just the press. Military families, veterans, and, in true Gen Z style, a group of young TikTokers had been invited to capture the moment. She wore a blue suit, her hair tied high, holding a mic. But her eyes shone with rare pride. Before her were representatives from veteran groups, including Karen Torres and Tom Ellis, whom she'd met weeks ago. "We're not here to talk about me or the White House," Leavitt began, her voice filling the room. "We're here to honor those who serve in silence. Soldiers. Their families. Those carrying scars we don't see." She paused, looking at Karen, who was wiping away tears. Captain Sophie Marshall gave them a voice. "And today we give them action." She turned to the crowd. 40 million has been approved for mental health centers. But this isn't the end. It's the beginning. I'm not speaking for them. I'm here so they're heard. The crowd clapped, the sound echoing through the wide room. A TikToker raised their phone, shouting, "Silent service lives forever." Leavitt smiled faintly. She knew this moment would spread online. But she didn't do it for views. She did it for Sophie, for Ethan, for Karen, and for thousands more. She stepped down, shaking hands, listening to their stories. Karen hugged her, whispering, "Thank you. For my son." Leavitt nodded, saying nothing. But her eyes were red. After the event, Leavitt went home. Stepping into her small, dark apartment, she dropped her bag and headed straight to her son's room. He slept soundly in his crib, his face peaceful under the soft glow of a night light. Leavitt sat beside him, watching him, and smiled. She thought of Sophie, how she rose from pain, how soldiers now had a shot at healing. She opened her phone, seeing a text from Sophie. "I was just at Arlington. Thank you, Karoline." Leavitt texted back, "No, thank you. You changed everything." She set the phone down, leaning her head against the wall. Outside, Washington still glowed with lights, but inside, in a small corner, it felt more peaceful than ever. She didn't know how far #silent service would go, but she knew it had begun. From Sophie's late-night letter, from her own risky choice, from Ethan's pain, and the hope of thousands of soldiers. She closed her eyes, whispering to herself, "I did the right thing." At Arlington, Sophie walked out of the cemetery, her figure fading into the sunset. She no longer heard Ethan's voice every night. Not because he was gone, but because he had been heard. She smiled faintly for the first time in 3 years and kept walking. The story, Karoline Leavitt meets a young Navy captain. Their conversation sparks a nationwide discussion, reflecting real issues in American society today, especially veterans' struggles with mental health, media pressure, and the role of youth in driving change. In the story, Sophie carries her personal pain from Ethan Blake's death to speak for those who serve in silence. A stark reality when 20 veterans take their lives daily in the U.S., according to the Department of Veterans Affairs. Karoline Leavitt, as a young press secretary, uses social media and White House events to turn words into action, securing $40 million for mental health centers, a concrete step mirroring the urgent need to improve PTSD support today. The lesson here isn't just persist. It's how individuals can turn personal experience into a force for societal change. Sophie didn't stop at her pain. She faced criticism from the press and General Carver to defend her message, while Leavitt pushed past attacks from Fox News and Politico to drive real policy. This reminds Americans today, from students to office workers, that their voices have power, however small. Learn from Leavitt. Use platforms like X or TikTok to amplify ideas, just as she did with #silent service. Follow Sophie's example. Don't let fear of failure, like the South China Sea mistake, stop you from acting in a polarized, busy nation. The lesson is clear. Start with yourself. Stand firm in truth. Turn hardship into opportunity. Because even a late-night letter can change a country. Subscribe to our channel to help us spread the voice for silent soldiers like Ethan. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video to continue the #silent service journey.